Welcome to The Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Unprecedented is a remarkable collection of exclusive first-person stories on leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic from 29 chief executives at iconic Canadian companies. In this first part of a two-part series, I speak with Andrew Willis, business reporter with Globe and Mail and co-author and editor of this unique and necessary book. We talk about the story behind the book and the tradecraft of editing that creates this cohesive read. Lastly, I ask Andrew whether his reporting might change based on the experiences shared by these CEOs and the process of pulling this book together.
There is occasionally an instinct in journalism, first of all, to report on the negative, and second, to try for the gotcha stuff. And I think what I realized as a reporter is a lot of these issues are really complex. It is very difficult to run a big nursing home chain when you got labor issues and pharmaceutical issues and an aging population. It's really tough to run Canadian Tire when you can't get bicycles and you can't get all the auto parts that you need for your inventory.
Andrew, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
Really well, Michael. Thanks. Good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining me on the mic. I guess this is a bit of a different experience. Usually you're on the other side of the mic interviewing people. I get to interview you today, so that's really fun for me. So thanks again for being open to the opportunity.
I've spent 3 decades asking the questions. This is going to be fascinating. So yeah, let's get to it.
Right on. Well, let's jump right in. Tell us a little bit about your personal professional journey. I'm sure many of you know you from your work in the Globe and Mail, but talk a little bit about your background and what you do for a living today.
Sure thing. I'm the business columnist at the Globe and Mail, and I've been at the Globe and Mail on and off since the 1990s. And basically, I'm asked to sort of get inside the boardrooms, talk to the CEOs, and explain the underlying strategies behind business. Humanize business for the Globe and Mail audience, but also really try and get ahead of the trends. Try and talk to people, talk to our readers about where things are going. I took a brief break from business journalism to actually work in corporate communications. I was at Brookfield Asset Management for 6 years, a few years back, which was a really neat experience because it taught me how a big business really does work. And that was really useful when we got to this book project. Because with Unprecedented, I was asking CEOs for their trust as they told their first-person stories about the pandemic.
Well, I noticed that in your LinkedIn profile, and it's such a great thing to do if you have the opportunity, right? Be on both sides of the table so you can kind of get a sense of perspective from both sides. So I think that really makes your reporting that much more insightful because you've sat in that same chair of trying to communicate and, craft a narrative that helps the business. All right. So what we're here to talk about is this great new book with your co-author, Steve Mayer. And the book is Unprecedented, Canada's Top CEOs on Leadership During COVID-19. It's a fantastic book. Let's first talk about the origin story. Like, what was the inspiration for the project? Where did it come from? What did it take to get the project greenlit? Somebody's got to put, books out on the shelf. And, it was published just recently in April. When did you start? So give me a bit of the backstory for the book itself.
Sure. Steve Mayer, my co-author on this, he's an investment banker. He's the head of a boutique investment bank in Canada called Greenhill. And he was advising companies early in the pandemic on, basically how to raise the money and to survive, what to do. And then some of them were executing on some big transactions even during the pandemic that the M&A went on. And what the CEOs were telling Steve was like, wow, we're making this up as we go. There's no playbook for how you deal with this crisis. There's no case study at Harvard or Ivy on, what you do when there's a global pandemic and all your employees are locked down. And someone, and in this case, it was actually the CEO of a company called Finning, which sells heavy equipment. The CEO said, someone should write a book on this. And Steve said, yeah, someone should write a book on this. And over at the Globe and Mail, in the early stages of the pandemic, I was doing these first-person interviews with CEOs. So I got the CEO at Stelco. I got Deborah Flynn, the CEO up at Toronto Pearson Airport, just to talk about, what this felt like and how they made the decisions on, in the case of Pearson, laying off employees, shutting down the food services, getting the security redone so people didn't get sick standing in line for an airplane. Like those sort of first-person stories. And honestly, Michael, we can measure our readership of the Globe and Mail with clicks and with the time spent on the stories. And anything we wrote about COVID leadership was off the scale in terms of reader appeal, in terms of hits on our website. So I knew we were onto something. So Steve had this idea originally to take some of these stories and do them as a book. He reached out to me. We the two of us have known each other for years. He reached out to me. He said, look, would you be willing to kind of be an editor and be a writer and work with some of these CEOs? I've got a bunch of CEO connections. And that was sort of the genesis for it. So this was probably now, in retrospect, midway through the pandemic. So we'd come out of the first really tough lockdowns. And we were sort of talking to one another, but the crisis was by no means over. And at that point, we started an outreach program. And the idea, Michael, is, as you can see from the list of the 30 CEOs, we tried to target individuals running companies who were right in the middle of the storm. So we went to the airlines, and to our pleasure, WestJet and Air Canada signed on. And we went to the grocery store chains. Sobeys signed on. We had a lot of conversations with Loblaws. They didn't end up participating. Canada Goose, Lululemon, they came in. And then we went to some of the better chapters. I think some of the more incredible chapters are from the long-term care operators, the nursing home chains. So Revera and Sienna, they helped out. We got Couche-Tard, the parent to Circle K. And in a really fun one, we got the parent to Tim Hortons, which is Restaurant Brands International. Yeah. And they're interesting because in addition, obviously, to Tim Hortons, they own Burger King, they own Popeyes. They're a major player in the U.S. fast food industry, which meant they were dealing directly with the Trump White House.
They're across the world, right? I mean, they're a massive. I remember I was interviewing some folks in there, and they were talking about they open up one restaurant like every 2 hours or some crazy number. Like they have thousands and thousands of restaurants globally, right? They're big player.
They're massive. And one of the interesting points of this is Restaurant Brands is a perfect example. Is a lot of the global companies had an advantage over the purely domestic companies because they were exposed to the virus earlier. They had European or Asian operations. They had a sense of what was coming, and they were also. It felt to me, and you read this a lot in the book, they were able to bring techniques and management learning from their global operations and bring it into Canada and arguably fared better during the pandemic than companies that just had to do it based on what they were seeing in the Canadian market.
Yeah, I pick up on that point because a lot of the retailers that I spoke to in that time had kind of, let's call it an early warning system, right? Whether they were sourcing product from Asia or whether they were operating in some cases, they were like, this is big and this is trouble. How does this impact me? Now, for the listeners, I would say a couple of things. First of all, there's a long, 29 major CEOs. And for the retail, we've got Canada Goose, Canadian Tire, we've got Couche-Tard, we got McKesson Canada, which is Rexall, and we've got Sobeys. Now, the great news is with Sobeys, Michael LeBlanc is going to be my guest to talk about the book as well and talk about his piece next week. So I was really thrilled to get this. So I get to talk to you, and then I get to talk to one of the participants. So I'm really looking forward to that. So great story. Now, how did you 29 major CEOs. Oh, by the way, we should mention that the proceeds for this book are going to United Way, right? Is that the case?
Yeah, that's right. So we're donating all the author proceeds, and a lot of the companies have made donations to COVID relief charities, and we're funding it all through United Way. And to date, Michael, not to brag, but my contribution to helping Canadians through the pandemic is that this book's raised over $3 million. So
wow, congratulations!
Really honored by that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's been terrific.
That's fantastic. All right, so 29 CEOs participated, plus you had a forward from Michelle Romano, so let's call that 30. At the best of times, these men and women are extremely busy. They lead very tightly managed professional lives, and these were certainly not the best of times. How'd you manage to pull this off? Like how clearly you and your co-author have pre-existing connections to some, if not many, but just tell me a little bit about that and how successful you were at getting folks to participate.
Sure. We were honored that almost everybody we pitched saw the wisdom of the book. A few CEOs begged off, just, we're in a crisis, we're too busy. It's amusing would be the strong word, but it's interesting, Michael, when you eliminate air travel and you eliminate in-person meetings, a lot of CEOs actually found they had a little more time on their hands than normal, and they tended to spend it on operational issues. And look, most of the companies we reached out to, they first of all, they wanted a record. A number of the companies, including the airlines, frankly, they felt their story hadn't been well told during the pandemic. They were a little upset with some of the media coverage they got. So they were interested in getting kind of their account of how it all worked, and partly for an internal audience, but also for the world to see. And then these are big public companies. Most of them have communications groups. So, when I'm not sure the CEO sat in front of a typewriter in front of a keyboard for too long. I think they had help in writing their stories. I know a number of them have professional writers who are part of the group. But
you would be confident they still,
just like anybody working in comms, we gave them pretty tight deadlines, and most of them produced 4,000 to 6,000 words within 2 or 3 months. It was great working with a lot of them. They kept the stories personal. They didn't do them as press releases. I was really pleased to see that. And, you saw admissions that, during the early stage of the crisis, I was scared. Mm-hmm. I feared what was coming. And there were times when there was nowhere to look for answers. I had to look at our core corporate values. There's a lot of honesty is what I'm trying to say. A lot of honesty in the book.
My experience talking to leaders was they were either hit by the shockwave of demand or the sledgehammer of closures, right? It was really, who you were, what you sold, where you're located, what kind of customers relied on you. I mean, I talked to retailers who in the very early weeks were afraid of liquidity crises that then turned to, we can't get enough stuff fast enough. Like it was really a bit of a whipsaw. Now, talking about the book, it's a sprawling book over 500 pages, 30 different contributors, yet somehow it feels cohesive. So, talk about the editorial process that makes it a very actually readable and I think essential book.
Well, I'm really thrilled to hear you say that it feels cohesive because I did work really hard on that. Yeah, look, the overwhelming arc is one of, look, take us. We asked each CEO to sort of, in your own way, take us through your journey through the pandemic. So most of them started in those early days in February, March, when we realized that something bad was coming out of Asia, and that and then the lockdowns took place nationally in Canada, and that was kind of a common starting point for the stories. And then each story from there diverged as to just what happened at your company, and a lot of it is you're on the shop floor, you're in the warehouses with Mike Medline as he tries to figure out home delivery and how to keep Canadians fed, or Kruger Products, who makes most of the toilet paper in Canada. You're kind of working with their CEO as he realizes Canadians are hoarding toilet paper and he can't keep shelves at Costco stocked. Like,
what does that say about us, by the way, that the first thing we're worried about is toilet paper? I think
isn't that incredible? I think the LCBO and the toilet paper were the first things. We stocked up on booze and we stocked up on TP.
Cannabis did really well.
Real phenomenon.
Bread makers, and then it's so. It's funny as I've watched the demand curve. Suddenly, there's it's bread makers, and then it's coffee espresso makers, and then it turned out to be everything from tooth whiteners when the mask started to come off. Like, you can really reflect society and what sometimes is purchased.
The other side of this, though, Michael, and this is a leadership lesson, is that institutions were behaving the same way as you and I as homeowners. So you mentioned McKesson was one of the participants in the book, and their relatively new CEO, Rebecca McKillican, she was confronted with they run a huge drug distribution business, and the hospitals across Canada are their major clients. And she ran into a phenomenon where the hospitals were hoarding drugs. They were worried that the drug supply chain would break down. They wouldn't be able to get a hold of key pharmaceuticals. And McKesson was running out of drugs. So they had to go through this exercise where they went back, they reviewed all your previous pharmaceutical orders, and they started rationing drugs to the big hospitals. And McKillican said the only way we could do that was to be completely transparent about our supplies, about each of the value of each customer and what they'd ordered in the past. But she said they were really tough conversations with key clients in order to prevent hoarding and to prevent shortfalls in drugs for individuals who really needed them. It was like the scale of the fear that we felt as a society. It wasn't just you and I hoarding toilet paper or red wine. Like, there was a lot of really important industries that were really worried about the supply chain, and I think, frankly, are still very concerned about the vulnerabilities in supply chain that we saw in the crisis.
Yeah, I've got a question about that later on to ask you. Now, as you reflect on the different stories, and you're already kind of in and around this, did you pick up any central themes, like any kind of central narrative that the readers will take away from the book? Anything jump out at you? Say, if you had to summarize this book and what you learned, or the central theme in kind of a sentence or two, or is it just too sprawling to kind of trap it like that?
No, the way that I try and think as a journalist is that you got to have themes to your storytelling. So I've sort of picked off three. Is that the first is that the companies that did well here, and not everybody did well, but the companies that did well, they were very agile. They showed a lot of ingenuity and they showed a lot of empathy. The agility, like out of the retail world, was actually one of the best examples. Was the Couche-Tard, so the Circle K chain, as we talked about a minute ago, Michael. They had a first look at what the pandemic was going to mean for their operations when it hit Europe. And they had a store in Poland, of all places, where the store manager or the regional manager figured out how to put plexiglass around the cashier so the cashiers could stay healthy, even while the store stayed open and while that first wave of COVID was running wild in Europe. And they had the ability, the agility within their management system to get that idea from Poland to head office in Montreal, and then out to the huge network of convenience stores they've got in North America. They were, and by being quick, they were able to pre-order the plexiglass, and they were able to, everybody eventually figured this out. Sobeys figured it out, Loblaws figured it out, but Couche-Tard, I think, can take credit for taking an idea in Europe and within a matter of weeks having it rolled out right across the chain. And that was huge for their staffing. The ability to say to a cashier, you can come in, you can work an 8-hour shift, and you're not going to get sick if someone coughs on you. That kept those stores open. And so that was one of the key themes. A lot of the companies had that, where they were able to move ideas quickly from the front lines up to head office and then to the rest of the company.
Well, picking up on this theme of kind of lessons learned, where you seem to be at least out of the most intense phase of COVID. I mean, we're not out of it completely, out of the COVID era. Now, while we're out of that, trouble at global scale is not over. I mean, from free-floating anxiety of climate change to war in Europe, there's always another crisis to deal with. And some of them are pretty big orders of magnitude. Now, after reading and interacting with these CEOs, do you think Canadian businesses will come out on the other side of the COVID era more resilient, more agile, more battle-tested, more ready to take on what's next? Or is there always that temptation to the kind of regression to the mean and picking up the old habits? You think we've formed some new habits that'll actually serve us well?
I really think that the pandemic has strengthened Canadian business. We talked a moment ago, Michael, about this whole concern with supply chains. It's very real, and you're seeing right through from banking, through pharmaceuticals, through all the manufacturing industries, this recognition that having a domestic ability to make something is a huge advantage, even if it costs more, and you got to pass that cost on to consumer. There's a reliability factor that is really important. And look, again, going back to chapters in the book, the folks at Canada Goose were all over this, right? Mm-hmm. Danny Reese, the CEO at Canada Goose, has always made domestic manufacturing a key part of what their parkas stand for. And even during the pandemic, when they were shutting down on some of the lines, Canada Goose could easily switch to making protective equipment for hospital staff, which they supplied at cost. And I thought that was a wonderful gesture. It makes for a great part of their story. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think when I look at all sectors, including retail, I think one of the signs of resilience coming out of this pandemic is a recognition that supply chains need to be shorter, and that if you can have domestic sourcing and a shorter supply chain, even if that means higher costs, that is going to be a net benefit and the consumer is going to get it.
So after 2, maybe 3 years of the COVID era, what do you think has changed? So, in business and culture, people, technology, and I'm talking about change structurally as opposed to kind of short-term accommodations to a very strange time in our lives. A lot of people, for example, shopped online, but now you see those numbers go down because they're now going back to the store. So as you reflect on the COVID era and as you do your reporting today, what do you think has changed structurally thanks to? Or
that's a really good question. And I think that it's going to take us a while to sort out where the consumers changed and what they do and don't want. And look, again, you've got Michael LeBlanc coming on, and he'll talk about this a lot. But I think that Sobeys did a great job with Voila of bringing on a home delivery system that probably would have taken them a couple of years, and they got it up and running in a couple of months. And that is to their credit. I guess the biggest change that I feel will be permanent is the acceptance of remote work. You mentioned Michelle Romanov. She's the dragon from Dragon's Den and the co-founder and CEO at Clearco, a big finance company. She's got a great line, and she says in the book, she says, as a leader, prior to the pandemic, I would have told you that if you're not at work, you're not really working. She figured that anybody working from home was actually doing their laundry or cooking rather than doing their work. And what she realized was that her company, which is in software, was in finance, it became much more productive when people didn't have to commute and weren't, moving around. So I think remote work will be permanent. The thing that we're all trying to figure out is how you maintain corporate culture, Michael, and how, if you're a younger employee, how you get mentored, how you get promoted, if you're not in front of your bosses, if you're not working with coworkers day in and day out. So I'm still optimistic that people are going to go to offices, but I do think that we've shown remote work can be a permanent part of most people's jobs. And I think that is a social benefit. That's huge. I mean, it really helps it helps women who are trying to balance anybody who's trying to balance different issues, but trying to balance family and workplace issues. If you can work remotely effectively and still get paid, still get promoted, huge change in your life.
Well, and I'd echo that. I mean, I think, the technology was always there. It was always a cultural barrier. People didn't want to hire senior roles that weren't sitting in bum and chair at, with a cup of coffee at 9:00 in the morning. That was all about culture. And it's interesting as I talk to retailers and they reflect on, well, if we're going to build team, because you're right, cohesion is hard, right? Culture is hard, particularly the younger. Mentoring is harder. So how do we think outside the office? I've talked to retailers who are bringing people together more frequently, more often to other settings, not just the office, right? So that demarcation between the office as a place to have a meeting and work together, but really let's find a third place, not the home, not the office, a third place. So that's how it'll be fascinating to see how it all evolves.
And Michael, even cutting edge companies, Shopify is not in this book, but I know that Shopify still believes that, although they've talked a lot about, we may never have an office, they still believe in getting people together to launch projects and to build teams. That's still critical to everything we do. Yeah. The other thing that I think has become I don't know about a permanent change, but certainly a shift in the way that leaders think, is that you had a lot of CEOs in this book talk about the fact that in the past, when they had to make a decision, they could take the time to get all the data they needed and all sorts of analysis, bring in McKinsey, bring in the consultants. And in COVID, they didn't have that opportunity. They had to make decisions very quickly. So they had to fail fast if something didn't work, realize it didn't work, move to something else. Or this value that I talked about empathy, about making decisions based not just on profits or on data, but also about, who are your core stakeholders? What are your core corporate values? And a lot of executives said, once we were making decisions with everybody in mind, it was actually relatively easy to make decisions. It was just a very different approach. I'm not sure if I'm stating that as clearly as I'd like to, but some of these companies really thought a lot more about their employees' needs and their communities at large than I think they had prior to the pandemic. And I like to think that that's going to be a permanent change.
Looking forward, do you think the COVID era and now the war in Europe, has it broken the back of globalization as we knew it? You referenced that about supply chain challenges, stuff closer to home. I mean, the reality is it's a very difficult thing to do, and supply chain challenges are real. I was reading an article yesterday that automakers are buying, if you can believe it, washing machines and stripping them of their microchips. So this washing machine company saw this sudden growth in their sales, couldn't figure it out. Turns out to be a car maker that was stripping out washing machines for chips. Is this a sea change of kind of this religion of regimented efficiency, right? Like if we would have spent $1 million on PPE and stored it, pre-COVID, it would have been, that's a waste of money. Post-COVID, we spent about $1 billion to get it here quick. Like, do you think this is a real change in globalization from a perspective of businesses?
I do think there's been a real change on things like just-in-time inventories and sourcing single source suppliers from with long shipping lines and everything determined by who's the lowest cost supplier of a given good. Yeah, I think that has changed. And it's not just retailers that have been banging the drum on that. If you look at some recent speeches from the CEO at Royal Bank, Dave Mackay is really going hard on the need to develop, if not domestic Canadian supply chains, then North American supply chains. And it fits the political agenda right now, right? Bring the jobs home, create jobs in your own backyard as opposed to sorting them out. Look, ultimately, the consumer is going to have to decide, are they willing to pay a little more? Because especially early on, there will be a supplier who's may be able to compete on price due to lower labor costs. But yeah, I think there's been a global recognition that having these long supply chains leaves you vulnerable, and ensures that some of the major parts of your life, like pharmaceuticals, those products are no longer under control of the home company. So that, I think, that's going to be a rethink. I don't think globalization can actually be stopped, because ultimately our economies are all linked. But there will be a rethink of where the jobs go and where the plants go, and how you source suppliers and how reliable your suppliers are. Some of the companies that I know in food manufacturing, for example, got down to a single supplier relationship. I don't think I'd take that chance based on what I saw in COVID. I think I'd want 2 or 3 suppliers of flour or of eggs or of critical ingredients if I was running a bakery.
Yeah, it's a little less efficient because now you're dividing your volume in threes, but this is the point, right? It's a little less efficient, a little more costly, but
it's not all driven by P&L. It is also driven by reliability and by what you want to stand for in terms of your values as a company.
Yeah, it feels like Mexico and South America is going to be, if we can have a winner out of this horrible thing, that this I see more pivot to manufacturing. A truck drive away or in the same continent or second continent.
It's interesting you mentioned Mexico. One of the stories we've been writing right through the pandemic is this enormous fight between the 2 big Canadian railways over a railway company that's basically got the monopoly on all the rail lines in Mexico. Yeah. Everybody thinks, like it's a continental strategy now in manufacturing, and that's huge. And it's meant that factories and supply lines into that country are now at a premium.
All right, last question. Has this process as a reporter, the COVID era, these CEO insights, does it change your reporting or how the media can and should report on these big, complex stories?
That's a really good question. I mean, there is occasionally an instinct in journalism, first of all, to report on the negative, and second, to try for the gotcha stuff. And I think what I realized as a reporter is a lot of these issues are really complex. It is very difficult to run a big nursing home chain when you got labor issues and pharmaceutical issues and an aging population. It's really tough to run Canadian Tire when you can't get bicycles and you can't get all the auto parts that you need for your inventories. I have a new appreciation for just how difficult it is and how many facets of business have to go right in order to get products on the shelves. So, I think coming out of COVID, I think there's more sophistication in the reporting on healthcare and in the reporting on industry. I really think this was an education process. And from my point of view, as someone who worked on this book, and I can say this for a lot of my colleagues at the Globe and Mail, companies were very open about talking about what they were going through. They knew they needed to communicate to their employees, to their stakeholders, and that openness was really welcome, and I hope it was reflected in the coverage.
Well, the book is unprecedented. Canada's top CEOs on leadership during COVID-19. My guest is Andrew Willis, a great business reporter at the Globe and Mail. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me. The book is now out and available at everywhere you like to buy books, right? And if someone wants to get in touch with you, maybe they got a story to tell, or maybe they just want to connect, and how do they get a hold of you? Are you a LinkedIn person, or what's the best way to get a hold of you?
I am a LinkedIn person. My email address is on my Globe and Mail articles most days, and I am always thrilled to hear from new sources. And thanks for this opportunity, Michael. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, it was great, and I hope you enjoyed being on the other side of the mic. I guess I should ask you, do you have anything else to say? That's always the closing question I get, to fill in kind of the interesting parts of the interview. I am just profoundly grateful that 30 CEOs are willing to spend the time and support this project. So a big thank you to every frontline worker who put it on the line during the pandemic, and a big thank you to all the CEOs who helped this project. Well, congratulations on the book. It's a great read. I'd recommend it to every single person listening, and for raising that kind of money to help for the United Way and to help COVID. And thank you for being on the Voice of Retail podcast. A real treat to talk with you, and I wish you continued success and good reporting. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for tuning into this special episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, be sure and click and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically twice a week. And check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Conversations with Commerce Next Podcast, and the Food Professor Podcast with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. Last but not least, If you're into barbecue, check out my all-new YouTube barbecue show, Last Request Barbecue, with new episodes each and every week. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of M.E. LeBlanc Company and Maven Media. And if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at meleblanc.co. Have a safe week, everyone.